I have had the same question since I was an undergraduate, which is, what does it mean to sound Black? Like, what does it mean?
Hello, happy summer, and welcome back to Tomato Tomato. I am your host, Talia Sherman, and today's episode is a conversation and interview with the amazing, the incredible, the prolific, show-stopping Professor Nicole Holliday, my all-time favorite linguist. I had the insane privilege of being in her language and society class this past semester. So, this episode is a thorough discussion of Professor Holliday's research. We get into the impact of sociolinguistic research and theory, the development of African American English, the evolutions of American dialects, the connections between different subfields of linguistics, all that in addition to talking in depth about Professor Holliday's research on digital voice assistants and automatic speech recognition, and of course, her consistent research question, which has remained constant: what does it mean to sound Black? We answer that question in the episode as well. This was an honor to record and produce. I feel like I'm going to repeat myself a lot throughout the episode, and you're going to hear me say over and over again how much I respect and appreciate Professor Holliday. But I need to say it here as well that she proves every single day that sociolinguistic research can have a social impact, that it does have a social impact, that linguistic research in general matters an incredible amount for the world, for how we move through the world and our understanding of humans in general. So I feel immeasurably lucky to be able to learn from her and to showcase her expertise on this platform. But anyway, please enjoy this conversation between Professor Holliday and myself. We are two exceedingly energetic people who love linguistics very, very much. And I think our enthusiasm comes across in the episode. But more importantly, I hope that anyone who listens to this podcast will be inspired to take an interest in language. So, with that, please welcome back into your ears my professor and my mentor, Nicole Holliday. Professor Nicole Holliday, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, it's great to be with you.
It's so great to see you. As I told you previously when we were talking, I was like, this is my Noam Chomsky interview. This is a big deal. You are a big deal. To me, to the world, to Netflix, to Insider, to Wired, to YouTube, to Twitter. Big deal on Twitter. And a big deal at Pomona College and a big deal, in academia. So welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you so much. It's weird when people introduce you as a big deal. Like, it's not even like faux humility. I'm just like, oh, right, I did do those things, but like you kind of forget sometimes.
Exactly. Yeah, you just do so many of them, right? So I want you an opportunity to introduce yourself. What do you do in the world, and who are you, and why do you do it?
Yeah, I am a sociophonetician. So 50% sociolinguist, 50% phonetician, I guess, or depend 100% on Mondays and Wednesdays of one, and the other ones on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I don't know. I split my time. But basically, I'm really interested in how we can use very small parts of the speech signal to convey and interpret social information. So, a lot of folks don't necessarily like know this in a meta-linguistic way, but they have feelings. Like the way that someone pronounces a vowel or an S or something will lead you to a conclusion about what kind of person that is. And it's usually happening subconsciously. And to me, this is just like so fascinating, right? Like the way that someone pronounces an S can tell you things about them, or like, they moved their mouth in a particular way. And now I know that they're from a different place. Like this just doesn't seem like it should be possible, but it's how we do language all the time.
So you've done a lot in linguistics in terms of research, and like your research spans a lot of different areas and a lot of different fields. Your thesis, you study biracial men, you study politicians like Barack and Michelle Obama and Kamala Harris. You've done a lot with like digital voice assistants and automatic speech recognition, and then now prosody a lot, like suprasegmentals and phonetics. So what's the favorite corner of research at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, nobody ever writes their dissertation about the thing that they're gonna say that they're gonna do when they apply to grad
Right.
school, right? But I did. I'm like very proud of that, which is why I'm telling you. I have had the same question since I was an undergraduate, which is, what does it mean to sound Black? Like, what does it mean? Because this is a discourse we have, right? Like, this is way back in the day, but when there was the O.J. Simpson trial, right, there was one witness who said that the person that they heard sounded Black. And then there was a whole evaluation in the media about, like, can someone sound Black? What does it mean? And we never really did answer that question. I mean, in the public consciousness, but let alone, in the scientific way. So I want to know if we can manipulate properties of speech to sort of force different types of social judgments. And the reason I want to know that is because then we can understand how the judgments work cognitively, like sort of work in our mind. And we can use that to address issues of racial bias, for example. But also just because it's like interesting to understand how this works. So that has been sort of my guiding question. And it might seem like, okay, well, you were studying biracials. Like, how does that get you there? Well, some of these people have really incredible linguistic dexterity. So they engage in a lot of what we would call like style shifting. They have really command African American English and really command mainstream English and weave them together really brilliantly to do a social identity. So when you look at particular individuals that have this kind of flexibility, they might be able to shed some light on what it means to sound Black. The stuff I've been doing more recently, looking at like Siri and synthesized speech and how people evaluate synthesized speech. Well, we know that these systems are manipulated sort of by Apple and by other groups like this. So they're actually more tightly controlled than human voices. So we can mess with the settings of Siri, right? We can change the property of the voice to make it, I don't know, like more creaky like this or more breathy like this, and see what that does to the judgment, right? So you actually have this machine that allows you to be really flexible in its manipulations to help you answer that question sort of in a different way. So that's what I've been really excited about recently.
But it's still the same question. I really like that. So it's still the same question. What does it mean to sound Black? And can you manipulate speech, whether it's digital speech or other speech, to get it to sound quote unquote more Black?
Yeah, to sort of really understand where people are making these judgments, like what is happening in the phonetic signal that acts as a trigger for the listener to go, okay, now I've made a decision about this person's race.
Right. And just to like give people like a kind of an image of what that looks like, you did a study where you took a clip of Obama and you manipulated it and, said, okay, how Black does he sound now? And then changed it. And then, okay, how Black does he sound now? And what did you find?
Yeah, so this is a project with my friend and collaborator, Dan Villarreal at the University of Pittsburgh. And he was really interested in this kind of big picture theoretical question about like gradient change, right? Like at what point can you do a manipulation and it forces a judgment? And I was already doing all this Obama stuff. And so I was like, this is going to sound insane, but let's try it. And all we did, right, was in a particular type of phrase, raise the highest high point and lower the lowest low point. So we made the difference between the minimum pitch and the maximum pitch kind of sound more extreme. And then we asked people, how Black does he sound now? In 4 steps, right? So there's like the original condition, and then there's like up to the most extreme manipulation. And the more extreme the manipulation of the pitch difference, the more they say he sounds Black, even though they know who he is. Presumably, his racial identity is not changing from clip to clip in their minds, right? He's static, but they will still give these judgments. And the thing that I'm most proud about of this paper, which is really silly, my mom was like one of the first people that took that study. Because you just like, this is a hazard of knowing linguists. They'll always like rope you into their experiments. So I sent it to her and I was like, oh, do you have any feedback on the survey? And she was like, this is so stupid. Like, I cannot believe that they let you get a PhD in this. Like, there's no way you're going to find anything. Like, what do you mean? How Black does Obama sound now? He's always the same amount of Black. And then I did the whole study and got like the significant results. And the first thing I did was call my mom. I was like, you were wrong. My science is worth doing. So ultimately, we're all just trying to please our parents or prove them wrong, I think.
So, given that the question for you has always been, what does it mean to sound Black? And that you've done so much research into this question, what does it mean to sound Black?
Sometimes when I say that this is my research question, I frame it as from the perspective of speakers and listeners. And I think that's why I have to like give a Weasley answer, 2-part answer to your question, because what it means for me as a speaker, for example, to sound Black is something apart from the way that other people perceive me, right? It's a little bit independent. So like we can ask this with anything, like if you're a gay man, like what does it mean to sound gay? If you're, someone who speaks English as a second language, like what does it mean to sound, like you're speaking your second language, right? There's all of these like identity things kind of bound up in it. So for speakers, I think what they're doing sort of agentively, either at the level of consciousness or not, is okay, it's important for me to sound like myself, sound like where I'm from, right? Like to have my identity sort of make sense in the way that I perform it. For listeners, it's more about how we use social information to make sense of the world around us, right? So when you hear somebody and you go, okay, well, that person sounds Black, you're going to use that to do certain good or bad sociological things, right? That's a judgment that gives you information. In the same way that, like, if we hear somebody and we make an assumption about their gender or their age or anything else, right? These are clues, they're not definitive. And where we go wrong is when we use them to enforce stereotypes, for example. But like the age one is such an easy example, right? If you call somebody and you like hear a child pick up the phone, what you do is different than if you hear an elderly person pick up the phone. It's also different than if you hear a middle-aged person pick up the phone, right? So I think it's a little disingenuous for us to say things like, oh, well, we shouldn't ever like make social judgments of people based on how they sound. Like, one, we can't help it. And two, sometimes that information helps us communicate or helps us catch ourselves in our own bias, right? So one thing that I encounter a lot with students here, like in California, they say frequently that they've had a bias against people with Southern accents, quote unquote, whatever it means. And students here are always on board with like, yes, like people can have regional differences, like New York, Boston, Chicago, like that's fine. Those people can sound different. It's okay. But when you get to the South, because there's all of these other assumptions about class and politics and things, students will still sort of say, I don't know, I cringe when I hear somebody that sounds Southern. This is a problem, right? But if you know that about yourself, then you can say, I am now sort of making a snap judgment about a lot of things about this person, when really the only index that I have, the only thing that's pointing is maybe they're from the South. Well, that's a big place with millions and millions of people. So you can catch yourself, right? You can jump to the conclusion South, and then before you go to they must be somebody who I don't agree with politically, you can go, I've made that judgment. Let me actually listen to them. Right? That's what I hope we get out of this.
Yeah. And I think something that's been important for me to think about is like, what does it mean to sound like a woman? What does it mean to sound Black? What does it mean to sound XYZ? It's always, what does it mean to sound a certain way that's different from the standard? It's always comparing it to the white male standard. In the textbook that in our class, what it means to sound like a woman are features that are specifically compared to men's features. And the same thing goes for Black English. What is the difference between that and, standard American English or whatever that may be?
This is such a good point. Yeah, because a lot of times we talk about this, even people that, study African American English, that sometimes the language that we use or that's been used in the literature to describe certain features is always framing it like in the absence of something that you expect to be mainstream. So like take, for example, we'll call it like zero copula. So this is the thing that's like he wild versus he is wild, right? That is. Structurally, the is still there. Many languages do not have an overt expression of the copula, like Russian and Arabic, for example, don't in their standard forms. In African American English, it's optional, but we call that feature zero copula. Well, zero compared to what? Like zero compared to mainstream American English, which you assume always has the copula. It's obligatory. So there has been some movement sort of lately to think about not framing that as like a deficit, right? And this is what we talked about a lot in class with like women's language being, oh, it's not just different than men's, like different is one thing, but like inferior, right?
Okay, so people always ask me, like it's the most annoying question, but I suppose it's the most important question. But it's like, what's the application of the why does this matter? Why do you do linguistics, sociolinguistics? What are you going to do with that? How does that matter in the world? Like, I know that we all use language all the time, but like still, what's the point? And I always point to these two things that you did. One from 2022, a paper titled Language Specific Effects on Automatic Speech Recognition Errors for World Englishes, or one of my favorites from 2021, Perception in Black and White, Effects of Intonational Variables and Filtering Conditions on Sociolinguistic Judgments with Implications for ASR. And I just feel like these two studies perfectly synthesize what linguistics means in the world and why it actually matters and what we can do with sociolinguistic research to change the world or change the machines that humans make, which then change the way that we interact with the world. So I guess like turning that question over to you, what implications does sociolinguistic research have for the world? What are we doing with this research? What is going on in these two papers that is so valuably important?
Yeah. So, I sort of alluded to this, but like there are definitely legal applications for this, right?
Yeah,
So we know that eyewitness testimony, especially cross-racial identification, is pretty bad. There's such a thing as ear witness testimony, right? Can people recall who they heard? Can they recognize voices? What kind of demographic judgments do they make, right? So all of understanding how these judgments work has implications in the legal system for understanding if someone says that speaker was Black, well, were they? How likely were they to be right about that? I think also just science for science sake, like this is cool, right? I teach a class on linguistic discrimination. And one reason that I really like that class is that the knowledge that language varies systematically and that the way that we speak is part of our social, cultural, familial, historical identity, and that we have a right to that people shouldn't try to change us or take it away from us, can be really empowering for groups of people that have been historically marginalized or especially policed for the way that they talk. So here in California, right, African Americans, people that speak Spanglish, right? So many students over the years have been like, oh, I just speak Spanglish. Like I used to get in trouble a lot because I wasn't really speaking Spanish or English. And I'm like, well, but that's fine. Like you live in a community of people who do this. And if we call it language mixing or code mixing, then it sounds fancy. But when we call it Spanglish, everyone says, oh, you don't really speak a language, right? So I think the point is also that this can be a really valuable way for people to understand how they move through the world and to resist sort of dominant cultural narratives that there's something wrong with them because they're not upper middle class and white and from the Midwest, right? That they're sort of allowed to sound the way that they sound and they can take pride in that. And I'd say the other thing too is I hadn't really thought about this until I started doing more research on speech synthesis, but there are people who have diseases where they lose their voice, right? Or like laryngeal issues, voice box issues, different types of cancers, traumatic injuries, right? So those folks have to use a synthesized voice. The technology for synthesized voices has gotten so much better, so much more recently. So like you can imagine, if you've ever heard Stephen Hawking or somebody like that has this kind of automated, very robotic kind of voice. People don't have to sound that and like that anymore, right? He chooses to sound that way, even though the technology has advanced, because now sounding that way is part of his identity. But if you're a 16-year-old girl who has to have your larynx removed, you don't want to sound like a robot and you don't want to sound like a 50-year-old man. You want to sound like yourself, right? So understanding what it means to sound like a 16-year-old girl or to sound Black or to sound Chicanx or to sound gay or whatever we think, right? Whatever social identity can be important for those people, right? For their maintenance of their identity. If they do sort of lose their ability to speak, we can synthesize voices that give them that part of themselves back, which I think is a really exciting application.
absolutely. And then also with this specifically like those two papers that I mentioned, you're taking data from, automatic speech recognition or Siri or the digital voice assistants, and you're proving that it is biased against people who either, English isn't their first language or Black people or people with non-standard varieties of English. And you're saying, okay, here's the data. You're not just like leaving it at that conclusion. These things are biased. It's like, oh, what can we do to change technology so that it's not so biased? And that matters a tremendous amount, especially as like, you've answered this question before, but like as we enter the metaverse, like, you know, this stuff matters.
Yeah. So 75% of the people in the world who are speaking English do not speak it as their first language. And that is not even addressing the issue of people who do speak English as a first language, but they live in places where the English is marginalized. So, like Indian speakers, Nigerian speakers who do speak English as a first language, but these systems aren't set up for them, right? So, you have literally more than a billion people who are underserved
Yep.
by these technologies, which are increasingly parts of our everyday life. One thing in the research for that 2021 paper that I found just shocking, on some cars, there's this system called OnStar. So if you're in an accident, you can use the voice activation to say, I've been in an accident, call the authorities or, paramedics, whatever. OnStar didn't have support for Spanish in the United States until 2017. In Los Angeles, 50% of people speak Spanish at home. So this is a real, like, there's consequences here, right? Some people have cars that will assist them in the event of an accident, and other people don't have access to that technology because nobody bothered to design the technology to give them access. This is a real issue.
Yeah. It's crazy that you're building technology and then it just doesn't serve the majority of the people,
Well, it kind of
It kinda
works,
works,
right?
sort of.
So like if you're a quote unquote non-standard speaker, like yeah, okay, maybe it kind of works. But it's not fair, right? We talk about this as algorithmic bias. And it's how do I put this? It's not fair, and it's also an issue of, sort of capitalism and inequality because they're only building systems for people that they think will spend money on the system. And maybe that's fine if it's like, something that's optional. But as I'm mentioning, these things getting like increasingly integrated into our everyday life, they're not optional. Right. So you can't only build for the people who are spending the most money if it's an essential function of everybody's phone now.
Okay, so over the course of this semester, you were, up and out to go to give several really incredible talks at MIT, at UC San Diego, in Arizona, sort of all over the place. And we were all sad to see you leave class for however long, but you were giving talks about digital voice recognition, about digital voice assistants and automatic speech recognition. And I don't have like the actual paper online because it's not published yet, but in the
Oh, it just came
abstract,
out. It just
it
came
just came
out.
out. Oh my gosh.
In Frontiers.
No
So
way.
look for that. Yeah, like literally like last week. So you're not behind.
Okay, congratulations. Frontiers is big.
I haven't even updated my website yet. So
Oh my God. Okay, well that I guess is right. Okay, well anyway, in the abstract, you talk about how an assistant's tone of voice evaluation reinforces systemic linguistic bias and how speech recognition technology reinforces and perpetuates bias against already marginalized groups of speakers. So how does this work? Expand this. What does that mean? And like, I know in class you mentioned that Amazon has this new watch that analyzes your tone
yeah.
of voice, and that was like insane to us. So what is going on here with the digital voice assistants and stuff?
Yeah, so I was looking at two different things in that talk, and in this paper specifically, we're just talking about Siri. So there are now 5 options for your Siri voice if you want an American English Siri. There used to just be 2. They were called American English Female, American English Male. And then in 2021, they introduced 2 new voices and they started renaming them. So they're just called like voice 1, 2, 3, 4 now. But when they were in beta testing, people on Twitter were starting to say like, this voice sounds black, the one voice in particular. It's called Voice 3. And so I was contacted by a reporter from Consumer Reports, Kaveh Waddell, who was like, hey, people are saying this one sounds black. Does it sound black to you? And I was like, I mean, yes, but like someone should really test that empirically. Let me put together a study real quick. So I did before it got out of beta testing so that people wouldn't know that they were listening to the Siri voices. And indeed, like there are really dramatic differences in how people evaluate the race, but also sort of the personality of the different Siri voices. So that's the paper that just came out. I think it's really interesting because again, we're getting a view into how we think about human voices when we're looking at synthesized voices that we have a lot sort of more control over. So it's fun for the science. The other piece of that talk that I've been giving, and I'm still working on collecting data for this one, is with Paul Reed, who's at the University of Alabama. So there is this kind of Fitbit type device, the Amazon Halo, which does movement tracking, exercise, all of that kind of normal stuff, but also has this feature that does quote unquote tone of voice analysis. So it's supposed to tell you how positive and energetic you sound through the day. It also gives you some like weird qualitative adjectives sometimes, but basically you wear it, it listens to you, you download the data, and you can know if you sounded, I don't know, whatever it thinks sufficiently positive is. In the analysis that we've done so far, we find that this is really biased. First of all, for positivity, it seems to not even be listening to the tone of voice itself. It's only doing sentiment analysis. So it's like looking at how positive the words you use are, which is really fraught for use in naturalistic conversation because like we use hyperbole, we use sarcasm, like it doesn't really make sense. The other thing is it's testing for energy and like what does it even mean to sound energetic, right? We can't really pin that down. But it seems to give lower scores to women and Black people that we've tested because, of course, like the data that it was trained on, that's sort of the paragon, the best example of positivity and energy, is probably white speakers, and it's probably white male speakers, because they're seen as more standard. And so if it's training on that, then anybody that deviates from the model that it has trained on is going to get dinged. And what bothers me so much about this is what kind of person is interested in knowing how positive or energetic their tone of voice sounds, right? It's not people with power that are linguistically secure that are like, oh, let me buy this device that does that. It's people who are already worried about it. And then on top of that, the system reinforces the bias against them.
That's a really good point. White men are probably not buying this, or they're probably not worrying ever. Like, oh, do I sound wrong? Do I sound bad? You brought this up a lot of times in class, but it's like there are all kinds of products now to help women sound less feminine or like less weak. It's always equating femininity to weakness. Like, here's this extension you can add to Chrome that's going to check your emails to make sure that they don't sound, passive or weak, or you're not hedging too much, you're not saying just all the time. Like, why you brought this up? Like, why is it that women have to change? Why can't men be more polite?
When you think about it this way, it really kind of adjusts your frame, right? So this is like the deficit model of gender that we talk about, that women just need to be more like men. But yeah, like if you think about like, well, what would it be if we told men to be more like women? Not that anybody should have to change. I don't think that anybody should have to change, but it's the idea that certain people are always being policed, right? And it's people who already hold less social power for whatever reason, um, that have to be the ones to change, right? Black people have to speak standard at school, and women have to sound more like men in the workplace to get ahead. And like these are messages that we get all over the place, and it doesn't make sense, right? Like ultimately, I want people to have the power to sound like they sound and have that be okay in every single social situation and have it be something that we celebrate, right? We don't expect, except for in particular situations, we don't expect to encounter everybody wearing the same clothes all the time, right? We allow for people's clothes to be an expression of their individuality, their culture, their history, everything like that. Parallels between clothes and language are not always perfect, but I think there is one here, right? By telling everybody that they have to sound the same, it's like everybody must wear a white t-shirt and jeans every single day. That's a boring world, right? We don't want that linguistically either.
So you are interviewed a lot about American dialects because for some reason there's this idea that they're gone, they're leaving. The world is getting all standardized. We're all speaking the same. American dialects, American accent, they're a thing of the past. And I think that even when I started doing some stuff in sociolinguistics, I was like, oh, this stuff's dying out. Like, geography is becoming less of an issue. Like other isoglosses are like not a problem anymore. Like, social media, the internet. And then you start actually learning things and you're like, oh, that's a ridiculous claim to say that accents dialects are just dying out, that that's just what they're going to do now. So what's going on with dialect evolution and how that relates to linguistic prejudice? And what's your take on this rumor that accents and dialects are disappearing?
Yeah, no, they're not. I think we don't, again, like this idea of metalinguistic awareness, like, can we talk about language? Some things that are very salient, sort of at the level of consciousness, may be receding, and that might be like the truth of dialects are changing, right? So I'll give sort of a reverse example. I never heard people say y'all in California when I first moved here in 2016. And now I have students saying y'all. And it's because of changing ideas about gender in part, but also that's spreading, right? Before that time, if you would ask me, is y'all going to die out? I might say, yeah, it's going to die out because it's stigmatized. It's kind of at risk in the South. Like 10 years ago, if you said y'all, everyone would say, oh, what part of the South are you from? It's not like that anymore, right? So this change is just always happening in all directions. So sometimes what we think is like really salient is misleading us in terms of interpreting the larger pattern itself. So some things that change are really subtle. They're things like the vowel moved up a little bit, or the voice got a little more creaky or a little less creaky or a little more breathy, right? And we don't always see those changes in progress. Sometimes we see them later, right? Once people started complaining about creaky voice had been happening for like 20 years before the media got like mad about it.
Right.
It was pervasive. So It's hard to say at any particular moment, like where the change is. I think some people are drawn to the idea that there is dialect leveling or that dialects are disappearing because they imagine that if there are fewer differences in the way that we talk, they'll be like not having any communication issues. But that's ridiculous because also those differences do communication too, right? They do knowing where someone is from or how old they are or something like that, or having a good guess about it can facilitate this kind of conversation. It's not a barrier, in addition to just like letting people be who they are, right? So I think people want to believe that the dialects are disappearing sometimes. The other thing that I'll say is really happening to my mind is people are more mobile and they are increasingly talking to people that are not located in the same place as them. That's true, which does have effects on individual varieties, regional varieties. But there's also like political realignment happening too. So one thing that I've personally started to notice is the use of Southern features by rural people in the Midwest to index a political identity, right? Conservative political identity, even though they're not from the South. So you see features spreading in this way. And then also conversely, right? In cities in the South, for example, some people will retreat from using traditional Southern varieties because they don't want to be imagined as rural or conservative. And so things are always moving, they're always changing. But I think the urban rural distinction is going to be even more important as we go ahead, sort of alongside the regional differences that we've always seen.
That's a good point because the urban rural divide is what you brought up. I think it was like the first day of class this semester was like there's this idea that accents and dialects are disappearing, fading out. And then also you gave us a reading on how accents in the West specifically are
Mhm.
sort of transforming and changing in really interesting ways. Yesterday, I was listening to Heather's for whatever reason, and like it's about the mean girl. Well, I guess the example was she says the line, for a greasy little nobody, you do have good bone structure. Today, if you're going to portray a mean girl, she would not talk like that. She would say, for a greasy little nobody, you do have good bone structure. Like,
Yeah, it's true.
and that's from the 90s. Like that does a progression. Mean Girls today, the musical, the way that they're talking is more in line with like how we hear the mean girl, the iconic image of the mean girl in our heads. But Heather's is, from the past, so it's different. And I think that that's interesting how it's like our idea of the way that the popular girl talks has changed because there's been these shifts in California and the West. And like you sent me that paper about, it's the theory that it's a jaw movement that
Yeah, there's some
right.
like people think that there's like physiological things, like ways to accomplish this like sounding Californian.
Yeah.
One thing I never thought about, there's a researcher at BYU, Joey Stanley, who has been really interested in like what is the Mormon Utah accent.
Ooh, yeah.
And there's like gender stuff going on there too. And I never would have thought about this as a thing that exists. But when you talk to people from Utah, they're like, "Oh yeah. There's a Mormon girl way of like being. There's a persona,
Mhm.
and this interacts with our regional features, and it's very what we would call unregistered, right? It's a thing. People know it's a thing, and once I started listening to this data, I was like, whoa, yeah, there is like a Mormon way of being. So I think we imagine that dialects are just like disappearing, but they're kind of like mass, right? They can never be created or destroyed.
Yeah. Okay, so the piece of information that I am like never going to forget from anything that you've told me ever, and I've learned a lot, believe me. But I feel like the thing that really blew my mind the most was when I came to office hours and I was like, I don't understand the different hypotheses for how AAE developed. I don't understand how they're like the difference between the Creole hypothesis or the substrate hypothesis or the Anglicist hypothesis. Like, explain this. And you explained these different hypotheses, but then gave a pretty interesting explanation for why one hypothesis might be correct over another, given certain structures of slavery in the US versus in the Caribbean. And I was wondering if you could explain what you said to me, these different hypotheses of how AAE developed and why they matter.
Yeah, so let me say that this is not settled, right? We don't have like
Yeah.
one unified we don't have one unified theory of like this is where African American English came from. The Creolist hypothesis, which is not the one that I necessarily subscribe to, says that African American English was a Creole, like Jamaican Creole or Haitian Creole. And over time, it's become more English-like, so it lost some of its Creole features, but we can still see some that remain. This is a theory that is a lot of prominent sociolinguists put forth. So John Rickford, for example, sort of believes in the Creolist hypothesis. If I had to pick one for myself, I believe kind of more in what we call the neo-Anglicist hypothesis, which means that African American English was not a Creole. It was English. It was English in contact with some West African languages for sure. But the reason that I believe this, or the sort of most compelling argument for this theory to me, is that the structures of slavery in what is now the United States versus in the Caribbean were very different, and the timing too. So when your primary crops are things like sugarcane, like what you had in Jamaica and Haiti, like in the islands, it's very difficult physical labor. You need a basically constant supply of young people who will not have long life expectancies to come and work on those fields. So in the Caribbean, there was more importation of people from West Africa. They were kidnapping people all the time for generations and generations. In the United States, of course, that was happening, but you started to get a lot more people that were born into slavery. And the reason is because they were farming different things. Like the slave labor in the US was a very different system. So if you worked on a plantation, you were farming most likely cotton or tobacco. This is very, very difficult labor, but not compared to sugarcane, not in the same way, right? So people did not die at as young of ages when they were working on tobacco plantations, for example. The second thing is we imagine, like when we think about slavery, we imagine like one, slave owner, quote unquote, having like 200 people that he's in charge of. That was a thing that happened in the US, but it was a thing that happened much more often in the Caribbean, where there would be these giant plantations with hundreds and hundreds of workers. In the US, many people who had slaves had 5, 10, right? We think about this with Thomas Jefferson, like people know the story about Thomas Jefferson. Part of the reason that he was able to have this non-consensual relationship with Sally Hemings, this a teenage girl that worked for him,
10-year-old, literally
and
14.
had
Yeah.
child,
Child. Yep.
who ended up having, via the rape, having children by him, is because she was part of a cluster of people that worked there and had more direct contact with him, right? When you have 200 people that are on your, quote unquote, working your land, enslaved on your land, that's a very different social dynamic. So what that means for us linguistically is imagine someone like Thomas Jefferson at any given moment has 5 or 10 people that are enslaved, maybe on a plantation, but also maybe doing other types of labor. They're doing domestic labor. They're in the house. They're doing like everyday things. They're watching children. That is a different linguistic contact situation. So those folks are getting a lot more input from English as opposed to folks who are on a big plantation with hundreds and hundreds of people where they don't actually interact with the overseer on an everyday basis. For me, that sort of predicts that the way that people would have acquired English is more in a more thorough way, right? More contact, more acquisition here than in those other situations. And in fact, not only that they had the opportunity or like the social situation was set up for them to have more English acquisition, they also had more motivation because when you have to talk to the people that you work for, as opposed to just be out in the fields, then knowing things about the language is more beneficial for you.
Right. And so that was a really revolutionary way of thinking about things for me, because essentially what you're talking about here is how history and the structures of power, but like really concretely, how the difference in the structure of slavery in the US for Caribbean influenced how an entire language or dialect, whatever you want to call it, emerged and came to be. And there's debate, and we're never going to solve it maybe, but it is really interesting to think about, how could African American English be a Creole? Is it really possible that, given how few slaves there were per plantation, that these different African languages are coming into contact, and then there's a creation of something new that develops, and then, now it's like its whole other thing because of other factors of history. But I think that is just it's not sociolinguistics in a nutshell, but it's a really, really interesting way of thinking about the world.
It makes sense, right? I wouldn't say that it's totally implausible that there was a Creole. Like, we don't know, right? We don't really have this kind of documentation. We don't have recordings from the 18th century, right? And I never want to disagree with John Rickford. So I will lightly say that I do not necessarily believe in the Creolist hypothesis.
Yeah. That's actually really funny. It's because, as you say over and over again, sociolinguistics is a tiny, tiny field. So
Nobody
John
come
Rickford.
for me. Don't
Yeah.
come for me.
We know these people. This is the question that I ask everyone, but why linguistics? And interpret that however you want. But why linguistics for you, for the world in general? And any hot takes about linguistics that you want to share with the world?
Yeah. Um, so our department at Pomona is linguistics and cognitive science. And I love cognitive science, but like I'm always complaining that we lose students,
Yes.
great students in linguistics to cognitive
All the
science.
time. I don't know what it is.
Because like I don't know, it's like you get to look at brains and we have neurolinguistics. You could look at brains if you want to look at brains, or psychology, or like it just maybe people think it's more interdisciplinary. I mean, I guess it is more interdisciplinary, but like to me, language is so fundamental to the human experience that if you want to understand humans, their brains, their society, why they do things, aspects of their psychology, all of that, there's evidence in the language, right? So for me, it's like the lens through which I understand the world is language. That's why. I, like a lot of people, got into linguistics because I was just like taking Spanish in high school. I was real good at it. Went to college. I was going to major in Spanish and Arabic. My friend's dad was like, why don't you take a linguistics class? I did. And I was like, this is what I've been searching for my whole life. Like a way to understand the world that's intuitive to me. And that's like what linguistics is. But I also think like if we're talking about addressing social inequality, which is very, very important, right, in our modern world, this is low-hanging fruit, right? We have done a lot of work to sort of make it so that it's not acceptable to openly discriminate against people because of race or gender, whatever. Still happens, right? But it's taboo. You're not supposed to, right? But you are allowed to discriminate against people because they quote unquote didn't sound professional.
Yeah.
Or something like that, which is so frequently a proxy for racism or sexism, classism, whatever. If we can open up people's minds to the idea that there are so many ways to sound that are valid and that carry our history with us, and that verbal skill isn't just one thing, that being articulate isn't just being one particular way that mirrors people in power, I think it's transformative. I think it really does make a difference for how people are able to relate with each other.
Guys, I'm like getting really excited over here on Zoom. I'm like, this is like,
It's just like snapping.
This is it though. This is transformational. This is the way that we view the world. It's language. What is the intrinsic property of humans that like differentiates us from other breathing living things? Language, linguistic ability. And to talk about, your experience as an undergrad figuring out that linguistics was for you, didn't you say it was the PDESFA study that changed your life?
Yeah. So I took, this is like so embarrassing whenever I talk to her about PDESFA because I like really fanned out about it. But like I took intro to linguistics, and then the second class I took was language and social identity in the United States. Very similar to what I teach now, language and society. And the professor at Ohio State, Gately Modan, was like, there's this postdoc at Georgetown. He's doing really exciting work. I'm going to bring him and he's going to do a class lecture. And it was Rob Podespa. He wasn't even a professor yet. He's like, here's my new paper about the gay diva persona and falsetto. This man stands up and he presents this paper, and I am riveted. I had never paid more attention to anything in my life as I did that paper, because I didn't really understand what prosody was, what sociophonetics was, like whatever. I just knew that what he was doing made sense to me and that that's what I wanted to do with my life. And it is a blessing to be that clear about loving something that much, right? I never wanted to do anything else. And it's also like an incredible privilege that I get to do this now. because I loved it so much, right? Like not everybody has those opportunities, but like it was like a come to Jesus moment, right? Like literally it's like I saw the light when I met Rob Podesta. And so I wish that for other people, right? That's part of why linguistics is so magical to me, is because it was just so clear that that's what I needed to do.
I feel the same way. It's totally a come to Jesus moment. Like when you figure out that there's a discipline that synthesizes it all. Because I think it is interdisciplinary.
Yeah,
Like
it is.
whoever says cog sci, yeah, you have to take philosophy. Like, I mean, well, philosophy is interesting, but like for linguistics, you have to like learn computers and you have to
Complained a lot about this in grad school. Like, I'm supposed to be like an anthropologist and a statistician and a computer scientist and also a philosopher all at the same time. But that is the beauty, right? Is that you get to engage with all these other ways of thinking when you do linguistics. Like it's never a dull moment, honestly, because it is inherently interdisciplinary. You've interviewed a lot of people that think about language sort of from different perspectives, which is really nice.
Yeah.
They're not actually siloed from each other. So one thing that I see sometimes that is upsetting is like sociolinguistics gets kind of put to the side because we're like, we're playing with these like social issues and identity issues and whatever. And sometimes people think it's not like as science-y as like psycholing or neuroling or something like that, for example, or that it's not really like as linguistic as like syntax or phonology. It's not that there are actually discrete boundaries between these things, right? So if you look at the work of some of my favorite people in linguistics, Rachel Weissler, who's at Oregon, she's interested in how people make the kind of racial judgments that I'm interested in, but she uses like neuro-socio-linguistic methods, right? So using the methods of sociolinguistics and neurolinguistics together, because once you start asking questions like, what does it mean to sound Black? You can also ask questions like, wait, can we see that in the brain? Right? So we're never actually doing things that aren't related to each other, right? It's just that your research focus sometimes can be in a particular way. But when you really start to get into the research, you start to notice that you can use so much more information from other sources. And so I guess I would say that if folks are interested in anything linguistics or language adjacent, that it's a really good practice to read really broadly. Like I never thought that I would read so much sociology and anthropology and physics and statistics in computer science, right? In ethics around AI, right? All the stuff that I'm dealing with now, I never thought would ever be useful for me. So this is, one reason I believe in the liberal arts education. Sometimes people will say like, oh, well, what are they going to do? Like study underwater basket weaving? Like we don't have that, right? But some of the classes that I took in college, even though, I went to Ohio State University, those things have been really helpful for me as a linguist. So I took Latin American autobiographies. It was really interesting. I learned a lot about variation in Spanish because I read all of these autobiographies, right? Before I even knew that this was what I was going to be like doing with my life. So I guess the main point is sort of like, you never know where the things that you've learned will be useful for what it is that you're trying to answer as a investigator, researcher, curious human.
Thank you so much for listening to Tomato. I have been your host, Talia Sherman, and that was my conversation with Professor Nicole Holliday from Pomona College. If you are interested in reading her research or in reading any of the research that was mentioned throughout the episode, you can check out the episode description for links to all that. And if you like this podcast, please tell your friends. Tell them. Let them know. Be like, hey, there's this cool podcast. You should definitely listen to it. It's on linguistics. And with that, have a great summer. I will speak to you next time, and stay curious.